Someone Like You by Sparkypasker, read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 48. 5:30 in the morning. The earliest you can be up without getting into trouble. Well, actually, as long as you are quiet and get your schoolwork done, there is no curfew when you are inside the dorms. It's outside where you can come across some problems. Between midnight and 5:30 a.m., ectoplasm has a multitude of clones patrolling around campus, just waiting to kidnap some unsuspecting student and unceremoniously dump them back into their dorm. Thankfully, this was much earlier than most of the other students would be awake. On his way out the door, Izuku noticed a small group, Shinso, Tokoyami, and Todoroki, sitting in the common room, seemingly finishing up on their homework. He also heard some sizzling coming from the kitchen and saw Bakugo making himself some breakfast before his workout. Or at least Izuku assumed so, considering the outfit Bakugo was wearing. It was interesting. Ever since seeing Bakugo punching Monoma, his heart no longer had a fit at the sight of Bakugo. Izuku wouldn't dare to assume Bakugo had hit Monoma because of what Monoma had said to Izuku, but it was very clear Monoma was the target. Izuku was on the floor at that time, so it wasn't like Bakugo had been aiming for him but hit Monoma instead. No, Monoma was definitely who Bakugo meant to hit. Maybe Monoma had pissed off Bakugo earlier in the day, and that was just a convenient time for Bakugo to vent his frustrations. Yeah, that was probably it. Izuku stood before the tall gates of UA when he was a child. He had dreamed of walking through these gates. But once it had actually happened, he found it was far from what he had expected. The classes were nowhere near the quality he had thought they would be, not including his classes with Nedzu. He actually had learned quite a bit from his classes. He just had to make sure he didn't simply copy Nedzu's codes and technique, like Sir Night-Eye had. It was how Izuku had managed to hack into the investigation information after all. And Izuku couldn't have someone learning Nedzu's habits like he had done and doing the same to him. Izuku removed a student ID from his pocket. A stylish, blonde-haired boy stared back at him. He held his breath as the keypad flashed 3 times before becoming a solid green. The doors opened. Izuku slipped through the open doors as soon as he was able, then began to casually walk down the sidewalk. There was no way any random passerby would have thought him a UA student. It was dark out, and he was wearing a dark, oversized sweatshirt with a hood. It was one of those soft features Aizawa had added to his closet when he moved in. And it was thanks to that he was able to walk peacefully down the street, the occasional car passing by without a single glance in his direction. Izuku flinched when a honk from a vehicle broke through the silence of the morning as he rounded a corner heading towards his destination. Some people were so rude. Who would honk a horn at 5:45 in the morning? After just a couple more storefronts, Izuku turned down an alleyway, then began running. He had to make sure he got to the Yakuza hideout before the heroes did. The heroes were planning on using only the information obtained through official city records and Sir Night-Eye's quirk. It wasn't enough. With the use of quirks, it would take nothing to change the layout of a basement or inside of a house. They were essentially going in blind. Only Izuku was willing to do what it took to make sure they actually succeeded. Once he was about 2 blocks away from the compound, Izuku stopped running and leaned up against a building and removed his phone from his pocket. The HPSC had taken his old one when he was arrested, and his current one was gifted to him by Nedzu. It had taken forever getting all of Nedzu's tracking software off of it. Of course, he did that when he was still on campus. He wasn't stupid. If he had waited until now to do it, he was sure Nedzu would have gotten some sort of notice that the phone had been accessed off campus. Once that was done, Izuku was able to access the files on his old phone. He needed to make sure the HPSC hadn't gotten any of his information. He may be willing to put himself in danger, but he would be damned if any of his contacts would even get glanced at. As soon as he found that the HPSC hadn't been able to crack his encryption, he made sure to cut off all contact with his old phone. Even if it was unlikely that the HPSC would ever be able to hack into the phone, Izuku couldn't leave the microscopic chance alone. He sent a signal and instructed the phone to burn itself up. Somewhere in an underground laboratory, a man with dark, disheveled hair and eyes like QR codes frantically typed on a computer connected to a plethora of towers. No matter how much power they added, they just couldn't crack the encryption. It shouldn't be that hard. It was only a phone. The man started to smell something burning, which wasn't too unusual. When you were working this much hardware, as hard as he had been, sometimes things burn up. He was just going to have to figure out which one it was and replace it. Dang it. This was going to set him back at least another hour. He stopped typing and stood from his chair, intending to grab replacement parts from the supply closet, but smoke started to accompany this burning itself. And it wasn't coming from a tower. No! He screamed, recognizing the smoke was coming from the phone. He quickly disconnected it from the system of computers in an attempt to reduce the burden on the device and save as much information as possible. But it was too late. The smoke quickly became fire. He grabbed the fire extinguisher from underneath his desk, pulled the pin, and then squeezed the trigger, all while pointing it at the phone. Maybe the fire only affected the case. Maybe the technology inside was still safe. He stopped spraying the foam as soon as he was no longer able to see any flames. He picked up the still warm block and shook the foam off. It was all melted. All of it. No! It was gone. It was all gone. Now what was he supposed to do? The president wasn't going to be happy about this. And done. Now that wasn't eating at the back of his mind, he could finally get down to doing what he was actually planning on doing. Izuku stuck his hand into the front pocket of his hoodie and took out a small handful of little metal grains of rice. One of the rules he had to follow while at UA was no direct contact with any of the support course students. If he needed something, he needed to fill out a request form. It would be reviewed by the faculty for safety and necessity, then given to the student they believed would be able to fulfill the order. They knew Izuku had ordered things from Hatsume's family in the past, and, although it was completely legal at the time, they wanted to avoid anything that could be construed as problematic. So what did Izuku do? He followed the rules. The staff knew he was going to need his gear back eventually. He filled out the forms, handed them in to Netsu, who then sent them to Powerloader. The thing was, the equipment he was accustomed to using and what he needed in order to do his job as a hero was specialized. And no one was talented or knowledgeable enough to make it other than Hatsume Mei. And of course, Hatsume would never just take anything at face value with Izuku. She was able to read through the lines and get Izuku what he actually wanted. Biomechanical flies. Izuku would use them to infiltrate areas with little to no security cameras to hack in order to get a look at what was going on inside. The villains wouldn't be able to tell any difference from a regular fly. Now, getting these flies from Hatsume was a little harder. Thankfully, all the first-year classrooms were on the same floor, so it was impossible for Izuku to completely avoid Hatsume, especially while on breaks between classes or in the lunchroom. Whenever Hatsume finished a fly, she would fly it into his pockets when they were in public areas. She was always tinkering around with something, so it wouldn't have been unusual to see something in her hands, even if it were to blatantly look like a controller. No one would even bat an eye. It never did, but that was beside the point. Well, back to the problem at hand. As long as he didn't overload an area with flies when there was no reason to have them there, it shouldn't be a problem. Like this area. This might be a problem. From the information the police were able to obtain, the head honcho overhaul was a germaphobe, and this was his home. It's unlikely he would allow any flies to stick around for long, so Izuku had to limit the number he put into the building and make sure they stayed out of sight. So 6? Yeah, that sounds like a good number. The compound is large enough that many flies shouldn't be noticeable, especially if he spread them out. Using his phone, Izuku started up 6 of the flies, then returned the remainder to his pocket. They spread out into the air and started traveling to the compound from different directions. One entered the compound from each of the cardinal directions, while another came from straight above, and the last entered the sewer system to find an underground entrance. It took longer than expected, but wasn't too horribly difficult to find his way in. Most of the windows were tightly closed, but there was one that was cracked open just enough for the fly to get through, and the one coming from above found what looked to be a vent pipe. The one coming from underground, however, what it found was surprising. There was an entire entrance into the compound's underground. The fly was able to sneak through the small opening underneath the closed door. It found itself in a large concrete room with a stage on one side and an open floor plan. It looked almost like an auditorium without the equipment. It flew itself up to the ceiling and continued across the room to the open door on the other side. It continued to fly through the halls, mapping the basement as it went. The basement was far more expansive than Izuku had even dared to think. Was this due to Irinaka Joy Mimic's quirk? No, it couldn't have been. He can't normally control something any larger than a refrigerator. Even if he pushed himself, it wouldn't have been enough to move the walls of an entire compound of this size, not without a significant period of time allowed, which Izuku is assuming Overhaul would not be willing to provide. So it would have been something years, if not decades, in the making. It must have been started by the prior leader of the Ch48. Not that that mattered in the grand scheme of things. It was just an observation that described how screwed the heroes are when they limit themselves. They have absolutely no idea what they're getting themselves into. If Overhaul retreats into this underground cavern, they were never going to catch him without significant losses. Well, that finalized Izuku's plan. He had to be here. There didn't seem to be any other secondary exit. So once the heroes entered through the front, Overhaul was going to try to escape using this underground passage. And Izuku was going to stop him. End of chapter.